In this week's lecture, we are going to talk about the global financial crisis and the Eurozone European debt crisis. The global financial crisis or global economic crisis is commonly believed to have begun in July 2007 with the credit crunch, when the loss of confidence by US investors in the value of subprime mortgages caused a liquidity crisis. This in turn resulted in the US Federal Bank injecting a large amount of capital into financial markets. By September 2008, the crisis had worsened as stock markets around the globe crashed and became highly volatile. Consumer confidence hit rock bottom as everyone tightened their belts in fear of what could lie ahead. The housing market in the United States suffered greatly as many homeowners who had taken out subprime loans found they were unable to meet their mortgage repayments. As the value of homes plummeted, the borrowers found themselves with negative equity. With a large number of borrowers defaulting on loans, banks were faced with a situation where the repossessed house and land was worth less on today's market than the bank had loaned out originally. The banks had a liquidity crisis on their hands, and giving and obtaining home loans became increasingly difficult as the fallout from the subprime lending bubble burst. This is commonly referred to as the credit crunch. Although the housing collapse in the United States is commonly referred to as the trigger for the global financial crisis, some experts who have examined the events over the past few years, and indeed even politicians in the United States, may believe that the financial system needed better regulation to discourage unscrupulous lending. The collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 14, 2008 marked the beginning of a new phase in the global financial crisis. Governments around the world struggled to rescue giant financial institutions as the fallout from the housing and stock market collapse worsened. Many financial institutions continue to face serious liquidity issues. The Australian government announced the first of its stimulus package aimed to jumpstart the slowing economy. Australian then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and then Treasurer Wen Swan delivered their first budget in response to the global financial crisis, with the main objective being to fight inflation, a major problem in the local economy at that time. Let's have a look at the European debt crisis now. The European debt crisis is the shorthand term for Europe's struggle to pay the debts it has built up in recent decades. 5 of the region's countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, have to varying degrees failed to generate enough economic growth to make their ability to pay back bondholders the guarantee it was intended to be. Although these 5 were seen as being the countries in immediate danger of a possible default at the peak of the crisis in 2010 to 2011, the crisis has far-reaching consequences that extend beyond their borders to the world as a whole. In fact, the head of the Bank of England referred to it as the most serious financial crisis at least since the 1930s, if not ever, in October 2011. So, how did the crisis begin? The global economy has experienced slow growth since the US financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, which has exposed the unsustainable fiscal policies of countries in Europe and around the globe. Greece, which spent heartily for years and failed to undertake fiscal reforms, was one of the first to feel the pinch of weaker growth. When growth slows, so do tax revenues, making high budget deficits unsustainable. The result was that the new Prime Minister George Papandreou in late 2009 was forced to announce that previous governments had failed to review the size of the nation's deficits. In truth, Greece's debts were so large that they actually exceed the size of the nation's entire economy, and the country could no longer hide the problem. Investors responded by demanding high yields on Greece bonds, which raised the cost of the country's debt burden and necessitate a series of bailouts by the European Union and European Central Bank. The markets also began driving up bond yields in the other heavily indebted countries in the region, anticipating problems similar to what occurred in Greece. So, why do bond yields go up in response to this type of crisis, and what are the implications? The reasons for rising bond yields is simple. If investors see higher risk associated with investing in a country's bonds, they will require a higher return to compensate them for that risk. This begins a vicious cycle. The demand for higher yields equates to higher borrowing costs for the country in crisis, which leads to further fiscal strain, prompting investors to demand even higher yields, and so on. A general loss of investor confidence typically causes the selling to affect not just the country in question, but also other countries with similarly weak finances, an effect typically referred to as contagion. What did European governments do about the crisis? The European Union has taken action, but it has moved slowly since it requires the consent of all nations in the Union. The primary cause of action thus far has been a series of bailouts for Europe's troubled economies.